he had a patient in the hospital, and it was her first baby, and she was in for delivery, but it was her first child, as I mentioned, and she was going to be hours and hours and hours and hours away from delivery. So it's the weekend, he goes home, and he decides to do some yard work. So he's raking leaves, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he develops a profound compulsion to go back to the hospital to attend this woman. This doesn't make any sense, so he calls the nurses and he says, check her again. They say, nothing's changed. It's hours and hours away. Keep raking leaves and stop bothering us. So he does, and the compulsion will not leave. Furthermore, it becomes associated with a severe discomfort in his chest. The discomfort grows to an actual pain. This is not heart disease. He's a young, healthy guy. And eventually, this becomes so bad that he feels like, as he put it, he was drowning. And the compulsion got worse as well, so he found himself getting in his car and speeding to the hospital. And the closer he got, the better he began to feel. And when he walks onto the OB/GYN floor, he feels terrific. And the nurses look at him and say, well, you know, we just talked to you. What are you doing here? And he said, in all honesty, I have no idea. At that moment, they hear a scream from his patient's room. He grabs a nurse and goes to this patient's room just in time to deliver a healthy baby. Now, after that, this became invariant. Every time he had a patient nearing delivery, he began to have the chest discomfort and the compulsion. And this became so predictable that the nurses began to use this as a clinical indicator of when the patient in the hospital was going to deliver a baby. And the veteran nurses on the floor would tell the young nurses who go to work there, you know, look, go ahead and assess your patient as usual, do all the usual things, but if you're ever in doubt about when she's going to deliver, just call him up and ask him how his chest is feeling. This premonition experience is on file at the Ryan Research Center in Durham, North Carolina, which is the biggest collection of these things, I guess, in the world. And so it involved a woman that they call Amanda, not her real name. And she's a young mother. She has a dream one night that the chandelier in the baby's room falls from the ceiling onto the baby, kills the baby, and demolishes the crib. During the dream, she also sees on the bureau in the baby's room a clock which reads 4:35 in the morning. Well, she wakes up horrified. She wakes her husband up and tells him the dream. He tells her it's silly, it's just a dream, go back to sleep, which he promptly does. And I wish some of y'all would write a paper on the response of male spouses to women's premonitions. You see this over and over, and in so many of the cases that I use in the book, you see this. The woman has the premonitory dream or vision or whatever it happens to be, and the husband is a total disbeliever. And usually, or often, comes around as the thing gets played out. We see that also happen. Well, Amanda cannot go back to sleep after this horrifying nightmare, so she gets up and she brings the baby back to bed with them. And a couple of hours later, she and her husband are both awakened by a loud noise in the baby's room. They both go in. Sure enough, the chandelier has fallen from the ceiling onto the baby's crib and wrecked the darn thing. It's demolished. And she looks at the clock on the bureau, and it reads 4:35. She dreamed this down to the moment, but the baby wasn't hurt because she had the courage to act on her premonition, therefore adding to the survival of the baby. We always very commonly get back to survival in many of these types of premonitions. I find that there are a lot of misconceptions that many Americans have about what really happened on that day with respect to those 4 doomed planes. I think most Americans assume that there were 4 full airplanes that crashed, killing all those passengers. It wasn't exactly like this. The planes were 80% empty. The range of vacancy was 74 to 85%, with an average of 79 to 80%. This didn't hold for one of them. This had to do with all 4 of them. I fly a lot, and I don't know about you, but I just don't get on planes that are only 20% full. These were busy routes, and this was not what you would expect. But a lot of people found some reason not to fly. Just last week I was giving a talk about this particular topic in a psychology conference in Orlando, and one of the people on the program was a woman that many of you will probably recognize, Jean Houston. I had heard that she had an experience around 9/11, and so I had an opportunity to ask her to tell me about that. And she said that she actually had reservations on one of those planes that crashed into the Twin Towers. The story was that she was to give an address at the United Nations on 9/11, and she woke up that morning, and she just knew when she opened her eyes that something horrible was wrong. She didn't know what it was, and this is classic. In these premonitions of disasters such as this, it is rare for people to wake up and say, gosh, you know, I dreamt that the plane crashed and I'm not flying today. It usually doesn't work like that. It's usually ambiguous and fuzzy, but it can be extraordinarily potent. She said that she had a feeling of profound malaise that came over her when she got out of bed that morning, and she knew in an instant she could not go to New York. She calls up the UN and she says, I can't come. They said, this is the United Nations. You do not cancel. She canceled. And she did not let them push her around on this point, and it saved her life. Now, you remember on June 1st, Air France 447 crashed in the Atlantic. What was it, 228 lives lost. The very next day, this guy shows up on Dutch television, Steven Van Ost. He lives near Amsterdam, and he had a ticket for this round-trip flight. And Steven didn't have a premonition about a plane crash, but he got a call from his friend before this flight departed, and his friend was his good buddy. And his friend had a premonition, and he told Steven, if you go on that plane, you are never coming back alive. And he said there's something terribly wrong about this plane. And so Stephen took that seriously and canceled, thereby saving his life. But there was a fabulous study that was good, represented good science, and was done in the right way. Back in 1956, a gentleman named William Cox looked at train wrecks. Riding trains was a heck of a lot more popular in the 50s than it is today. And he examined the vacancy rates on 28 crashed trains and then compared them to the ridership rate on the 7th, 14th, 21st, and 28th day prior to that. And he found that in every case, there was no exception to this. The vacancy rate on the day of the crash was statistically much higher than on the preceding days I mentioned. So it would seem that if you do the statistics right and the comparisons right, you can make the case that people have some sort of unconscious premonition that compels them not to travel on the day of the wreck. Here's what happened. On March 1st at West Side Baptist Church, at 7:20, all the 15 choir members were supposed to be there because they began choir practice promptly at 7:25. Well, at 7:25, the church blew up. The walls just went straight out. The heavy wooden roof just crashed right straight down. And if anybody had been in this church, they would have been killed, almost certainly. But nobody was hurt because nobody showed up. It was the first complete no-show in the history the West Side Baptist Church. This had never happened before. So what do you do with that? You know, is that just one of those things?
The righteous